All the Marvel superhero movies that are coming out make it clear that there's going to be a sequel because they all have those after the title sequence things where they introduce a new character or a new threat or some new plot device that makes you know for certain as a viewer that there's more here. The Back to the Future movies had this. You always knew that there was going to be a sequel after the first one because Doc shows up and he's dressed in futuristic attire. Really, anything that ends on a cliffhanger with promises of a lot more plot to come means that you know you've got a sequel coming. The same thing is true with the book of Luke. The same guy, Luke, wrote both Luke and Acts as its sequel. But you don't really need to be told that because you get to the end of Luke and you can tell that there's still a bunch more stuff that needs to happen. Luke 24, which is the last chapter in the book, verse 49, has Jesus, who is risen from the dead, saying to his disciples, "I'm going to send you what my Father has promised, but stay in the city until you have been clothed with power from on high." So the story kind of ends abrupt. Luke was obviously designed to tell the story of Jesus on earth, what he did, what he talked about, how he went to the cross, how he came back to life just like was predicted, and then what he did after he was raised from the dead. That's great, but the problem is that's not the whole story. See, Luke and the early Christians were very sure that God had sent Jesus, his son, God in the flesh, to come and do these things and to make it possible for the gap between God and men to be bridged. But the early church and early believers were also very sure that what happened next in the life of the early church was also stuff that was from God. And they would have viewed this story as being one singular thing. Jesus comes, he does all these things, he recruits disciples, he goes to the cross, he dies, he comes back to life, he tells them that there's more work to be done, he ascends to heaven, and then the promised Holy Spirit shows up and walks them through the next phase of what God is going to do in his redemptive plan in the world. The part that happens after Jesus ascends into heaven and that covers the disciples and the development of the early church is what's recorded in the book of Acts. So what I'm going to cover over the next approximately 1 jillion episodes in this series on Acts is this book by the author Luke that is the sequel to the Gospel of Luke, which records the story of Jesus. So for this thing to make any sense, I want to take a minute to kind of cover how we got here and what's going on before we tear into actually looking at what the text says. To understand where we are in the book of Acts, we have to understand a whole bunch of history. I'm going to give you the fast version. The Israelites are a people with a very long history at this point. It goes all the way back to really the first Jew, Abraham, who the Bible says was called by God. God made a covenant with him all the way back in the book of Genesis. And the Jewish people sort of moved all over the ancient world. They became captives in Egypt. Eventually, they are freed from Egypt under the leadership of Moses. They go and conquer the Holy Land, Canaan, modern-day Israel. They set up shop there. They're ruled by judges for a time, but they really don't want judges and God to rule them. They want to be ruled by kings. So they demand of God that they be allowed to be ruled by a king. Now, all of this is like 1000 BC. Oh, God says through a prophet, it's not going to be a great deal for you, but sure, if you want kings, here you go. And so Israel exists as a unified kingdom under 3 kings, Saul, David, and then Solomon. But after Solomon, everything falls apart and the kingdom gets divided up into a northern kingdom that includes most of the tribes. Usually that gets referred to as Israel, and a southern kingdom that includes only a couple of tribes, and that usually gets called Judah. Well, the northern kingdom really struggles. They don't have a bunch of good kings, and eventually they get conquered by the Assyrians. That conquest obliterates the northern kingdom, and they are largely lost to history as a result. The southern kingdom, Judah, persists for much longer. They have some good kings, but eventually bad relations with the Babylonians bring down the wrath of Babylon upon them, and they get hauled off into captivity in the 6th century. And so now Israel just doesn't exist anymore. What's left of the people of Israel, the Jews, are captives in a foreign country. The Jews live in Babylon for quite a long period of time, and their fate changes when another people group, the Medo-Persians from even further east, that's modern-day Iran, come and invade. They conquer the Babylonians and take over. The Persians had a little different policy in terms of conquest. They were a little bit easier going, and so they liked subject people groups to be allowed to still function somewhat autonomously. They felt like it was a better way to govern and peace was easier to achieve. So this one particular Persian ruler, a guy named Cyrus the Great, tells the Jews that are living in Babylon that they can go home and rebuild Jerusalem, rebuild their temple, etc. If you've ever seen the movie 300, you know that somewhere in this time, the Greeks Greeks get into big fights with the Persians. They have all of these wars, and the end result is that Persia is significantly weakened. Now, the whole time, the Jews are loyal to the Persians, but just kind of trying to mind their own business and rebuild their little province. It's not long after that, the Greeks are kind of conquered/unified by a guy named Alexander the Great in the 300s BC. Alexander goes on this massive march of conquest through the entire ancient world, including modern-day Israel, Egypt, Babylon, that is modern-day Iraq, Persia, that is modern-day Iran, and even all the way into India. He makes his way back to Babylon because his troops are tired of fighting, and that's a long ways to travel, and dies at the young age of 33. Alexander names no heir. His generals divide up all of this newly conquered land amongst themselves and proceed to try to govern them. The general that takes control of the land that includes Israel does an okay job, and maybe his successors do an okay job as well. But by the time we get into the middle of the 100s BC, the Jews view their Greek rulers as oppressive and unbearable. There's some Greek rulers that particularly don't like the Jewish customs and try to Hellenize, that is, Greekicize all of the Jews, and the Jews push back. Eventually, the Greek leaders play their hand too far, and the Jews revolt under the leadership of the Maccabees and establish a new dynasty and a new kingdom in Israel that lasts for a nice chunk of time between the 2nd and 1st century BC. This all comes to an end when the Roman general Pompey makes his way to Jerusalem and conquers it in 63 BC. At that point, Israel becomes a province of the enormous Roman Empire, and they start owing loyalty and taxes to Rome. From the get-go, the Jews hate this Roman occupation, and they can't wait to get rid of it, but they don't have the military force to pull it off. This is a really important detail to understanding the Jewish psyche at the time that Jesus shows up. Way back in the Old Testament, there's all this language that God used with the prophets and the patriarchs about this Redeemer that he was going to raise up, about this kingdom that he was going to build, about this Son of Man who would come along and set things right, that when this Messiah would show up, everything would be changed, that a new era of blessing and a new age of relationship between God and man would be made possible at this moment. This notion of Messiah was not a new one. It's as old as Judaism almost. But the notion of Messiah evolved dramatically after the Roman conquest. The national identity started to displace some of the spiritual and theological identity. And more, the Jewish leadership and much of the Jewish populace started to imagine that the Messiah that God had promised would be a military, political leader who could get rid of the Romans and reestablish Jewish independence. But God had something completely different in mind. What he intended to do was to raise up a spiritual leader who would come along and bring about all of these blessings that God had alluded to in the Old Testament. Blessings that include a new covenant, that is a new arrangement between God and man, one that is much better if you happen to be on the man side of that. And additionally, the advent of a kingdom that the book of Luke talks about a ton. Now, this kingdom, again, is not a worldly kingdom. This kingdom is a spiritual kingdom, an eternal kingdom, one with a different set of ground rules, one where God's justice prevails, one where God's mercy is the new currency. Well, as you can see, these are two completely different sets of expectations. And as we look through the book of Luke, what we'll find is that these two expectations cause this enormous clash that ultimately ends with Jesus ending up on a cross. So as we get into the book of Acts, what we encounter is a situation where you have a Jewish leadership that has just orchestrated the execution of Jesus Christ. I'm sure the religious leaders felt a degree of satisfaction and completion upon the execution of Christ and felt like that could be enough of Jesus' kingdom talk and all of the things that he was about. But Jesus came back from the grave and nobody could produce his body. In fact, he appeared to all of these people, and it looks like not only has the religious leadership failed to crush what Jesus was doing, but that in killing him, they fulfilled prophecy and gave him the opportunity to be raised from the dead, and in doing so, it's thrown fuel on the fire from their perspective. So the Jewish leadership is frustrated, and they're keeping an eye out for any remaining vestiges of whatever the movement was that involved following Christ. The other side of the equation, you have people who followed Jesus for 3 years, who saw all the miracles and all the things that he did, and for them, there was no debate. They saw the miracles, they heard the teaching, they saw him come back to life. He hung out with them and had meals with them after he came back to life. Who are you going to trust? Political religious leaders who say this is how things need to be? Or a person who you literally saw just conquer death? Well, these disciples aren't going to be dissuaded. They were given a job. Jesus said, go back to Jerusalem, hang out, there's more to come, it won't be long. Well, we leave off at the end of the book of Acts with them having done just that. So Acts starts as a sequel with a tension already built in, and it's an age-old tension that has recently flared up. If If you don't understand those things about the book of Acts, what's going to happen here won't make as much sense. Hopefully that was helpful. Now, as we work on Acts, there are a bunch of historical details that I'm going to bring into the conversation, and I think that's really helpful because the original audience that Luke was writing to would have known all this stuff. They would have known who was emperor when, the same way you know who was president in 2003 and who is president right now. They would have known what each of these eras of Roman leadership and local leadership looked like in the same way that you know the difference between the Bill Clinton presidency and the George W. Bush presidency. All of that context was easy and assumed for them. However, 2,000 years after the fact, it's not easy and assumed for us, and we have to put forth a little bit of extra effort to bring ourselves up to speed so that we can understand this text the way the original intended audience would have understood it. It looks like Luke's work of Luke Acts covers material from as far back as 4 BC to as late as 65 AD. That's a big chunk of time, and every historical detail from that era that we can wrap our brains around is just going to help us understand the meaning of this that much better. I'm really into understanding the meaning of it the way the original audience would have, because that helps us get away from speculation and sentimentality and just reading into this what makes us feel good or is fun. Sure, it is the written word, and all written things are subject to, I suppose, a degree of reader's bias and interpretation. But in doing this series, my goal is not to reaffirm bias or interpretation. My goal is to try to do my best to just boil it down to what the author seems to be saying in these texts. It's your job to decide what you make of it and what you do.